You mentioned that your parents didn't tell you about being survivors of the Shoah when you were young. Do you remember when they started talking to you?
When I started asking them.
Do you remember when you asked?
Yeah, I do. I was around 16 and literature started to come out. Initially, second generation literature. And so I guess I knew enough to know that I was the child of a Holocaust survivor without really knowing what that meant. It's more an emotional or a feeling about being different, which I clearly had. And I just started to read everything I could get my hands on. And at that point, started to ask questions. And an example of that is that a cousin of my father's, who we were very close to, who I was very fond of, they didn't have children, married a non-Jewish woman. And till my wedding, and I was not young, I was not aware that she was not Jewish. So I don't know, if that was, though my mother said, oh, you knew that, but I don't know if I didn't remember because it made no difference to me, or in fact I wasn't told.
Do you remember what kinds of questions you asked your parents?
Just questions about, first initially what they went through, which I got a variety of answers or non-answers. And then, just questions as I got older about family.
Did they have any pictures of their families?
Occasional pictures of a brother or a sister. So actually throughout growing up, occasionally they meet someone who had this picture, so they get this picture. So I see it, but not many.
You'd see it and you'd know that person was
no
longer alive.
Yeah, I'd see it and my mother would say, oh, this was my sister. Yeah. Or my father, I remember having him getting a picture of his brother when I was about 20, so that.
So you were of high school age or even older when you were asking these questions. Did you feel they made your parents uncomfortable?
My mother wouldn't talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to do an interview, My father spoke about it, not so much to me, but he did do a tape. A tape. At those days, there were voice tapes, not videotapes, about his experience that he was from.
Who did he do the tape with?
Queensborough Community College Holocaust Center. Unfortunately, they don't have it because I asked for it, but somehow it got.
Did he get a copy?
I guess he didn't. Because
so you never heard it?
No.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
So did you feel you couldn't ask your mother too much? You felt she didn't want to talk about it?
Whenever we talked about it, she'd talk about her life prior to the war, which, I thought about one way, and then as an adult you think about it a different way. I realized that she was about 16 when the war started. So she actually never, that would be the age where one would rebel. And she never, so there was nothing, her idyllic childhood she had. And so, part of that comes from the fact that she couldn't rebel. She was actually sort of ripped away from her parents and sisters and brothers. So, I guess that's how she would remember it. My father was given photographs when he was liberated from Dachau, he said by an American soldier, so I have to assume that's how he got them. And my older brother knew about these photographs and actually brought them to school. I think he stole them. The story has a few different versions, but the essence is the same. And showed them to one of his teachers. He didn't realize that his teacher was a Holocaust survivor at that time. And when the teacher looked at the photographs, he yelled at my brother and left the room. So it was interesting because they're pretty horrific. I guess at the time they were horrific. Today you see them, so you see something a lot. It's not quite as horrific, but unfortunately. But and my father got called into school because my brother had done this terrible thing of bringing these photographs and got yelled at. So you know, I knew he did something, but he shouldn't, but I wasn't told what he did that he shouldn't do, you know, till he and I talked about it.
Had you seen them?
I hadn't seen them when I was in my 20s. I asked my father for them, and he gave them to me.
So you knew they were there.
Right.
You knew you couldn't see them, and you knew it was something terrible to take them to school.
Right.
Or for anyone actually to really look at them was something laden with terror.
Right.
Was there any discussion in school that you
School?
recall about
None. Not at that. No, not at.
What about you talking with your friends? Did you tell them that your parents had survived the Holocaust? Was this an open or closed subject?
No, I didn't. I was probably till about 10 or 11 embarrassed by it. You know, embarrassed by having parents who
Had
were different,
accents.
who had accents. You know. I don't know what the reasons for that was, but I was embarrassed by it. And then, you know, when I became interested and started reading, then I talked about it.
With your friends?
I don't know, yeah, anyone who wanted to listen, I talked to about it, or, you know.
So you didn't feel that the subject was forbidden for you to discuss with other people, but just not in school, but privately with your friends?
Right, and it wasn't anything taught in school at the time. And, you know, by the time I got into college, yeah, there was discussion about it. I mean, I remember having a teacher who, when he found out my mother was in the alleged ghetto, was fascinated and just kept questioning me. And I couldn't answer a lot of his questions, but I'd go back and ask my parents and sometimes get answers and sometimes not.
And would you go back and then tell the answers to the teacher?
Yeah.
He wanted to know.
He
really
wanted to know. Yeah, he really wanted to know.
What about when you said you were reading things when you were still in high school? Did you discuss what you were reading with your parents?
They knew I was reading it. I mean, and I'm sure I asked questions. As I said, my mother really didn't want to discuss it. It was yes, no, or, you know. And I guess I discussed it more with my mother than my father. So, yeah.
Was it any easier for them to, if you asked a more general question about the Holocaust, rather than saying what was your experience?
My parents weren't intellectuals, so it wouldn't have been, you know, they wouldn't have, you know, and it was personal for them. So, you know, my mother was a very intelligent woman, but she wouldn't have an intellectual conversation about the Holocaust. You know, it was an emotional, you know, deeply emotional thing.
Right.
And my father, I think. As I said, he majored tape, and I guess I must have been around 30 at the time. So he would tell me things. You know, when I asked for the photographs, he gave me the photographs, and he would discuss things like that.
So there was a little more openness when you were older, even.
Right, but there was cultural openness to the subject by that time. It was being taught in schools. Survivors were writing books, tapes were being made. There was, you know, a real move to document.
And that gave them permission to be a little more open about it.
Right.
Do you recall whether they discussed their families in Poland or their experiences with any of, like, say, your mother's brothers? Any people that would have gone through the same thing that they knew? Would they ever talk about it?
I'm sure they did, but I'm not sure they did actually.
You never heard it.
But I never heard it, right? you know, again, I guess I was in my 30s, but there was a film, there were 2 books that came out, very well documented books on the Lodz Ghetto, and there was a film made on it. And I remember showing my mother the book. She didn't want to read it, but we looked at some of the photographs, and she said, oh yeah, I walked over that bridge, or you know, I worked in that shop, but it was very factual, things like that. And we took her, my brother took her to see the film. And her reaction when she walked out of it said, well, maybe it touched the surface of what happened. But she didn't want to talk about it beyond that.
And you mentioned you were embarrassed by your parents when you were younger. What about when you were a teenager in high school? Because often teenagers are embarrassed by their parents, well, no matter what the parents are like.
Right, so it wasn't an issue of them being survivors, it was more an issue of I was a teenager and
they were your parents.
And they were my parents, right.
What did you feel that they had habits that were not totally American? I mean, were there things like that that bothered you?
You know, no, I mean, no. You know, in terms of the American, you know, Jewish household that I grew up in, I thought, you know, they were very normal. You know, they were a very middle-class family. I mean, my mother loved to go shopping. That was one of the activities we did together. You know, I always felt I was dressed nice. I mean, it wasn't that I didn't feel I had, as I was saying, you know. My mother had good taste, you know. She dressed me well. She dressed herself well. You know, I don't think I had any of those kind of things. My father was an extremely social person, so he made friends much more than my mother in many ways. So, you know, whoever lived in the neighborhood he was friendly with and was very social, always having people over. My house was always open to my friends, you know, my parents, you know, anyone we wanted to bring home, we could bring home.
Did friends ever ask why your parents had an accent or spoke in Yiddish at times?
Well, they wouldn't by that, you know, they wouldn't have, like by the time I was in high school and college, I mean, my mother's English was really pretty good, and I don't even know if they noticed. They might have noticed, but it wasn't.
They didn't say anything?
Yeah, they didn't say anything.
So when you were in high school, was there anything about your parents that you found annoying and backward?
Many things, I'm sure, but, and backward, annoying and backward. My brother, Mark, who's a year older, and I used to joke that they didn't realize till we were well into our 20s and not getting married and being hippies that maybe it was time for them to say, don't do this. So, you know, I think there were things they didn't like, but that was in the college years, and it was in the 60s, and, you know, there were whatever, it was their things that they didn't want us doing or saying, and of course it came down to, you know, I would have never done this to my mother kind of argument, you know, that kind of emotional argument. You know, but it was very much things I was living in those days. It was, and you know, I didn't get a guilt trip laid on me that we suffered or something. I really didn't. You know, I don't. At least, you know, the way I perceived my life, I didn't. Yeah.
So how could you didn't get any? How could you do this to me after all I've been through? It was more, I was nice to my mother. You should be nice to your mother.
Right. Right, it wasn't, at least I didn't see it that way, you know, I didn't see, I think my younger brother, who's 10 years younger, had that a little bit more, and when he and I spoke about it, it's, you know, I had a brother a year older and one 10 years younger. So he felt, and by the time he was born, my parents were better off financially, they had a house, they lived in Queens. My father took Saturday off, so they observed the Sabbath. So he felt it more, but he felt it more because he felt like, in a funny way, he was being brought up by 2 sets of parents. You know, like my brother and I, male, female, 10 years older, hippies, and my parents, who were his parents, who had other values.
Did your parents seem to worry about your safety outside the home, or their own safety? I mean, were there any concerns of that?
Not more than, you should be out late at night because... Just
the usual.
Yeah, the usual. Though as an adult, when I look back at, think about my mother, she hated to travel. She hated, not in any, travel a distance for a long time. So I wondered, where did that come from? Those kind of things.
What about health? Were there health concerns about the children's health on their parents' part, or their own health even? Did they seem more worried about your health than you would expect normally?
No. No. I mean, no. I don't know.
So then you have a time in high school where you begin to realize what your talents are and what your interests are. How were you thinking about yourself as you neared the end of high school and your plans for the future?
Well, I knew I was going to college. One of the things my mother told me, and this probably, again, as an adult, I understand from her Holocaust experience, was that you've got to get an education because whatever you have inside you, no one can take away. So that clearly came from her experiences. So I knew I had to go to college. By high school I was an okay student. I didn't have many academic interests besides doing art. I mean, I wanted to go to an art high school. My mother wanted me to go to a neighborhood high school. So, and not that, she was the person I drew with and I knitted with and I did all that with as a child. But
well, where would you have had to go to an arts high school?
Manhattan. Not that, and again, because, when I was 10, 11, and again, it could have been the way the world was and where we lived. At the age of 10 or 11, I was getting on the subway going to Macy's on 34th Street, going downtown Brooklyn. So I don't know that it was she didn't want me getting on the subway going to Manhattan school. I think she wanted me going to an academic school. That was, you don't go to an art school, you go to school, high school.